Welcome everybody. As you're joining us here in this virtual room, please do introduce yourselves in the chat, and we'll get going in a couple of minutes when the room fills up. Welcome people that are still just joining now. Please do say hello in the chat as to who you are and where you're from. We'll get going in just a minute when the participant number stabilizes. Okay, let's make a start, make most use we can of the time. Thank you ever so much for joining us today. Welcome. Welcome back if you've been at sessions already over the last couple of days, but I know people are joining us all through the weekend. So if this is your first session in Friends for Life UK 2020, thank you very much for being with us for this conference. This afternoon, we're talking about blood glucose control in sport and exercise. So I hope that was the link that you were hoping to click on. If it wasn't, I would suggest you stay anyway, because this is a really good session. My name's Chris. I'm just here to say a few introductions. Please do use the chat, as I know some of you already are, to introduce yourselves, make comments, chat as we go through the session. Please keep those respectful if you can. And then alongside the chat box, you'll see a Q&A box. Please put your questions for Gary in that, and I will keep an eye on that as we go along, and I'll feed your questions, group them together if there are similar questions, and feed them to Gary at the end. We'll make sure there is good time for questions at the end. So we're really fortunate this afternoon to welcome back Gary Scheiner. Gary is the owner and clinical lead at Integrated Diabetes Services in the US, a diabetes educator with many years of experience, and also someone who himself is type 1, has been for more than 30 years. So we'll speak direct from experience this afternoon, author of various books, which come highly recommended in our household. But most importantly, I think for this afternoon, Gary is a great friend of Friends for Life. So I, as a parent, attended my first Friends for Life conference 11 years ago with our daughter Hannah, and I can still remember the impact, the clear explanation that Gary gave about kind of what to do, how to think in different situations made in our lives. So we're always grateful and always learn new things, and I'm sure all of us here in this virtual room will. So Gary, thanks ever so much for joining us today, and over to you.
Oh, thank you for the intro, Chris. I really miss being at those Friends for Life conferences near Windsor. I had the greatest time at those meetings. The people were just so welcoming and warm, and it was just a lot of fun. And they always seem to happen right around our Halloween celebration. Today is Halloween for us. I don't know if you guys do any costumes or anything like that in the UK.
It's growing over here. It is growing, yeah.
Is it? Yeah. It's a fun event. So we're going to spend the next 30, 40 minutes focusing in on glucose control during sports and exercise activities. It's certainly a challenge. It's something that doesn't get nearly enough attention from a clinical standpoint. And there's not a lot of good research in this area either. A lot of what we've learned is from trial and error. But let me get started by just asking a general question to everybody. Now, to look at me, I'm short. I'm only, I'm a short guy. I'm short, I'm Jewish, I'm bald, I wear glasses, and I've got diabetes. So what do you think my favorite sport is to participate in? Is it miniature golf, accounting, or basketball? I hear everybody saying accounting. No, it's actually basketball. I love to play. I haven't had a chance to play since the pandemic set in, and I really miss it. I enjoy banging around with the big guys, and I've got my sports goggles on. My kids think I look ridiculous, but I don't care. I have a lot of fun playing. Managing my blood sugars during basketball is a challenge, though, and we're going to discuss some of the issues that a lot of us face managing the different sports. So what we'll focus on today is, first off, why it's important to manage glucose levels for sports and physical activity. We'll spend a fair amount of time on prevention of low blood sugar, which is probably the most common challenge and issue we run into. But we will also spend some time discussing rising blood sugars that can occur with certain forms of sports and exercise. And then we'll wrap up just discussing some logistical issues with some of the newer technologies that we're using now, including insulin pumps. So first off, we know from vast experience that glucose levels affect many aspects of our lives. It's not just long-term issues we have to worry about. What our blood sugar is right now has effects on our mind, on our intellect, on our emotions, but also on our physical abilities. It affects strength, it affects stamina, it affects our speed, our flexibility, and our safety, and our mental sharpness. So if you think about a sport or an exercise activity that you or your child partakes in, imagine being stronger, being faster, having more endurance, being more flexible, being sharper, and think about how much better you're going to perform. I find that's an excellent motivator for anybody who's looking for more reason to focus on their glucose management. All of these benefits that can take place when you engage in some form of sport or exercise activity. So where do we perform our best? I mean, technically, our bodies perform best when glucose levels are in a normal, quote unquote, non-diabetic range. But we have to kind of weigh that against the risk of hypoglycemia. If we go into a sport with a glucose of 5, there's a very good chance we're going to be low. So for the most part, we look for glucose levels in the 6, 7, 8, even 9 range as being an ideal zone for performance. We try our best to avoid glucose levels above 10 because that's a point at which we begin urinating glucose away, we become dehydrated, we lose energy. So that's something we try to avoid. And we also obviously try to avoid glucoses below 4 because that's going to hinder performance as well. And it's interesting, a lot of people think that they only have to worry about what their blood sugar is while they're doing their sport, but their blood sugar control around the clock does have an effect. If your glucose is elevated quite a bit before physical activity, it's going to affect your hydration level. As I mentioned, when glucoses are above 10, you dehydrate. And if you're not well hydrated, it's going to affect your performance. High glucose also affects sleep quality. You're not going to get into as deep a phase of sleep if your glucose levels are high. If you're not well rested, that's going to affect sports performance. And obviously, hypoglycemia has effects while we're exercising, but it also has an influence if we had a low blood sugar prior to the exercise. Low blood sugar causes a depletion of our glycogen storage. These are energy stores in our liver and our muscles that we use during exercise. And if they're depleted, it's going to affect stamina. And obviously, low blood sugars during the night impair sleep quality. And if you're not well rested, again, you won't perform as well. So let's talk about low blood sugar prevention first. I'm going to skip over this. I don't think it's that important to discuss. But let's look here. Now, when somebody who doesn't have diabetes begins to exercise or play some sport, if they don't have diabetes, their glucose level is going to start to dip. And as soon as that happens, their pancreas shuts off insulin production temporarily. The body also starts to produce hormones that bring the blood sugar up. We call these counter-regulatory hormones. So this combination of a quick withdrawal of insulin and production of these counter-regulatory hormones means that the blood sugar should not go low. You can run a marathon, your glucose should not go low. And anybody who doesn't have diabetes, who's had hypoglycemia when they exercise, there's something else going on. That's not supposed to take place. But if you consider somebody who has diabetes, who takes insulin, well, the big difference here is that the insulin level doesn't suddenly drop. I mean, you can reduce your basal insulin, there's things you can do, but because the insulins that we take last for many hours, we don't have the ability to say, okay, at this moment, I want the insulin level to drop. So it doesn't drop all of a sudden when we begin exercising. And when there's more insulin present than we need, it actually suppresses those counter-regulatory hormones. They don't act the way they're supposed to. Right? So as a result, we can experience, and we do experience, low blood sugar if we exercise and don't take precautions, don't make adjustments for it. There's a couple of ways glucose uptake is accelerated during exercise. Right, so this is not actually a biological diagram. I drew this myself, but I just wanted to explain the point. The way insulin works is it attaches to something called an insulin receptor. That's that red thing on the diagram. When it attaches to the receptor, it causes some chemical reactions to take place that shuttles glucose into the cell. So think of insulin being a key, the receptor is the door. When the key meets the door, it opens up, glucose can shuttle in. The point being that unless you have doors to open, those keys don't do any good. And when you're not exercising, your body cells tend to have very few of those insulin receptors available. When you're exercising, though, things change radically. The cells produce more of those receptors. And it's a need-based thing. They need energy, so you're going to produce more receptors, so the insulin can be opening lots of doors. And you'll see at the bottom right is a special little portal we call GLUT4. You don't have to remember that. But that is sort of like a revolving door. It doesn't even require insulin to shuttle glucose inside. That's present during the exercise. It disappears as soon as the exercise is over. The extra receptors, though, can hang around for a while. Sometimes people experience drops in their blood sugar many hours later, which we'll talk about in a moment. So, in the simplest standpoint, if you're trying to prevent low blood sugar and you're exercising for, let's say, 30 to 60 minutes, your best option is to consider the timing of the workout. If the exercise is occurring after a meal, you need less bolus insulin. The bolus is having the predominant effect during your workout if you're exercising after a meal. If you're exercising before a meal or between meals and it's been a while since any bolus insulin was given, then you should use rapid-acting carbohydrate. You notice there's no mention here of basal insulin, and that's because of the duration of the activity. With shorter duration activities, basal adjustments have very little effect on glucose and have very little ability to prevent low blood sugar. With longer duration activities, though, now basal insulin can be very effective. Cutting back on the basal ahead of time, I'll show you why in a moment, can help prevent the low blood sugar. So with long duration activities, we make the same adjustments we made for short duration. If it's after a meal, cut your bolus. If it's before a meal, take some rapid acting carb. But if that activity is going to go on for several hours, cutting back on the basal insulin is also very effective. You may also need to snack at regular intervals. You're going to need to watch for that phenomenon I just talked about, the delayed low blood sugars that can occur many hours later. Let's get a little more granular about how much to reduce the insulin doses. The answer to that question is I have no idea. I mean, it really depends on a lot of variables. It depends on the kind of activity you're doing, your level of conditioning, even the time of day. There's a lot of factors that come into play. But my general recommendation is if you're exercising after a meal and you don't know what to expect, cut your insulin dose, that meal dose, by a third. Take about a third less than you normally do and see what happens. If your glucose goes too high, then cut back less next time. If you drop, cut back more next time. It's a trial and adjustment that we have to go through. With competitive activities or anaerobic types of activities, blood sugars don't usually drop, and we'll discuss that in a few moments. If you're going to adjust basal insulin, the recommendation is to start out with a 50% reduction in your pump's basal insulin. That adjustment needs to be made at least an hour ahead of time. If you're on injection therapy for long duration activities, things that are going to last most of the day, you could consider reducing your dose of long-acting basal insulin by about 25%. You got to remember that that insulin is going to be in your system for at least 24 hours. So you're not only adjusting it during exercise, you're adjusting it the whole day long. So that's why it's harder to make these kind of adjustments when you're on shots. Being on a pump allows you, more ability to control your insulin levels while you're working out. So to understand the nuances of these basal adjustments, I want you to remember that when you use an insulin pump, the basal insulin is really just a series of tiny boluses the pump is delivering. I mean, we're talking tenths or fractions of a tenth of a unit every few minutes. And each little bolus has its own peak and valley to it, like any bolus does. When you add up all those little peaks and valleys, it produces a relatively flat level of insulin in the bloodstream. So let's say you were going to exercise for a half an hour, that window of time in the red box. You decide, I'll just suspend my pump or I'll disconnect while I'm exercising. And that'll keep me from going low. Well, will it? The level of insulin in the body actually looks like that heavy pink line. While you're exercising, there's virtually no change. Your blood sugar is still going to drop. We might see a bit of a drop after the workout's over, and you may see your glucose climb as a result of that. So that's why this is not an ideal way to manage your blood sugar for short duration workouts. Cutting the basal is not real, or adjusting the basal is not going to really help much, or not wearing the pump. What about a long duration of activity, 2 hours of cycling, hiking, football, whatever you're going to be doing? So if you have a 2-hour window where you shut off your pump or disconnect from it, what's that going to do? Here's what the level of insulin in the body looks like. At the beginning of the workout, for the first 30 minutes or so, there's hardly any change. Towards the end of the workout, the level of insulin in the body can drop dangerously low. And when there's a very low level of insulin in the body or no insulin, the blood sugar starts to shoot up really, really fast. You could also start to produce ketones. So we never recommend suspending or disconnecting a pump for more than 90 minutes. Instead, we use the temporary basal feature. Cutting back on the basal by about 50% an hour ahead of time produces a more satisfactory insulin pattern in the body. Personally, I find that if I'm going to do something fairly intense, like if I'm going to do some cycling at a good clip, I have to cut my basal about 70%. If I'm working around the yard, I can cut it 30 to 40%. So, you can play around with the number. 50% is just the starting point. So this is some research that showed the effects of suspending a pump as opposed to running a temporary basal rate and how the blood sugar, how much the blood sugar dropped. And I apologize, these are the numbers in the left are in milligrams. So divide by about 20, you'll get an idea. So those who just suspended their pump during their 60-minute workout saw their blood sugar drop by about 3.5 points. Those who cut their basal by 50% saw their blood sugar drop by about 2.5 points. Those who cut their basal by 80% still saw their blood sugar drop by almost 2 points. So this is why, again, for a 60-minute workout, basal adjustment alone is not going to save you from a low. So if we take a case study, this is a guy who plays lacrosse for 2 hours. He's playing after dinner. So what he does is he cuts his dinner dose in half. So he calculates his dose of insulin that he's going to take at dinner. It doesn't matter if he's on a pump or injections. Whatever dose he's going to give at dinner, he takes half the usual dose. Since he wears a pump, he disconnects the pump an hour before practice. But what he does is he reconnects hourly. and gives himself a small bolus to replace the basal insulin that he's missing. And that's a very reasonable thing to do. And he keeps some carbs handy just to make sure he has something if his glucose does decline. As far as using carbohydrate to prevent a low, obviously our goal is to prevent the low. It's not to wait until the low happens. So we want to use carbohydrate proactively. If you go into a workout with a normal glucose, you're going to need some carbs because it's not going to stay at that normal level otherwise. The amount of carb is going to vary depending on where your glucose is, what direction it's headed. You may need regular snacks for long-term workouts. And it's best to use snacks that have a rapid rate of digestion. Glucosate is a good example. Cereal, crackers, pretzels, actually anything you might use to treat a low blood sugar would be a good snack to use prior to and during an exercise session. And just to show the benefit of having regular snacks at regular intervals for long workouts, this graph sort of illustrates what happens. If you're going to exercise for a couple of hours and just have an enormous snack at the beginning, you get a pattern that looks like the red line, where you spike up and then drop, drop, drop. If you have snacks at regular intervals, you'll go up a little and come down and go up and come down. You kind of keep your blood sugar within a performance zone. You can keep your glucose in that 5 to 9 range where you're going to feel good and perform well, instead of just letting it run high, pass through your performance zone, and then wind up low at the end. Now, the amount of carbohydrates someone needs is going to depend on the type of activity, how much they weigh. There are charts in a number of books. John Walsh's Pumping Insulin book was one of the first to have this. I've expanded on it in the new 3rd edition of my book, Think Like a Pancreas. There's a nice big table with a lot of different activities listed. But just as an example, if you have a young lady who weighs 25 kilos and is going to take a dance class for an hour, she'll do probably fine with about 10 grams of carbohydrate. But that's not going to work for someone who weighs 100 kilos who's going to be swimming. They're going to need a lot more than that. So sometimes it's beneficial to combine both a snack and an insulin reduction so that you don't have to consume so much carbohydrate during an exercise session. Now, I wouldn't ignore just run-of-the-mill daily activities. Exercise is one thing, but just chores and things we do through the course of a typical day also require some extra carb. Cleaning, walking, yard work, housework, all of these kind of things need to be taken into consideration and need to be treated sort of like they're exercise. So here's a young lady who weighs 40 kilos and plays tennis after school. So what she does is she checks her glucose beforehand. If it's in a normal range, she has about 30 grams of carbohydrate. She has a little less if it's running high, a little more if it's lower. And then if she's going to play beyond an hour, she has another 20 grams, and that works nicely for her. So here's a question. What do you think would be better if you're trying to lose, as far as preventing low blood sugar, snacking or reducing your bolus? Having the carbs provides you a lot more flexibility. You don't have to time it, think about it ahead of time. It's the kind of thing you can do spur of the moment. Ideally, it's best to have those carbs 10 minutes or so before you exercise just so they can begin digesting a little bit. So it does give you a lot of flexibility using carbs. But cutting back on insulin is beneficial for anybody trying to lose weight. So if you want to lose weight, it's probably better to work out after a meal because you can eat your usual meal and just take a lot less insulin for it. And cutting down on insulin doses allows your body to mobilize its fat stores and burn that for energy a bit more. For those who are lucky enough to be using a hybrid closed loop system where a sensor and a pump talk to each other and there's an app or an algorithm that controls some aspects of the insulin delivery, there's certain things that we can accomplish with this, and there's certain things we can't. For the most part, just changing the target glucose is not that effective. The change has to be made more than an hour in advance, and it's usually not enough to prevent low blood sugar with more rigorous forms of exercise. But the algorithm built into these systems is very effective for preventing the delayed drops that can occur hours later. The closed loop systems are good at making gradual adjustments to glucose, but when things hit quickly, like a workout, dropping the sugar fast, they're not very effective in managing those. Some people switch their pumps into manual mode or non-closed loop mode for exercise. And for those who are using a do-it-yourself system, you have the option of setting up an override where you can set a higher target and cut back on the basal and bolus doses leading up to a workout, which I found to be pretty effective. So if you make these adjustments, your glucose should be beautiful every time you work out, right? Now, there's a lot of variables and we don't have control over every one of them. The amount of active insulin still in the body is going to influence the blood sugar during a workout. Where the insulin was given, whether it was injected or given through a pump, if it was given near a muscle that's going to be working pretty hard, the insulin is going to absorb faster, work harder, and run out faster. So that's something to consider. What was eaten recently? Was it something that's going to digest quickly and be out of the way, or is it still digesting during and after the workout? The time of day can have a major effect. The earlier in the day you exercise, the less likely the blood sugar is to drop, or the less it's going to drop, just because of hormone levels through the course of the day. Later in the day, the same workout will tend to drop the blood sugars more. Your emotional state has an effect. If you're anxious, if you're excited, if you're angry, whatever, your glucose may rise rather than fall. The hotter and more humid it is, the more the blood sugar is going to decline because the body has to work that much harder. Even your familiarity with the activity, once you become conditioned in a certain sport or exercise activity, you become more efficient. The blood sugar is not going to drop quite as much. Your prior activity can have an effect. If you've been exercising daily, you're already more sensitive to insulin going into the workout, so there may be more of a decline. Obviously, the size and number of muscles you're using. That's why full body exercises such as swimming, cross-country skiing, rowing, some forms of gymnastics, these will drop the blood sugar more than exercises that use isolated muscles, such as jogging or upper body work, and the length and intensity of the workout as well. And this we've mentioned several times, delayed onset hypoglycemia. I always like to get Homer Simpson into my presentations. He's one of my heroes. But this is a delayed drop in blood sugar, and it usually follows more exhaustive forms of exercise. We tend to see this with long, intense kinds of workouts. And it's caused by depletion of those glycogen stores that I mentioned earlier, and also the increase in insulin sensitivity that we get during a workout session. Most commonly, we see this happen 4, 6, 8, 10 hours after a hard workout, but it can go on for up to 24 hours. The way to prevent these, first you have to know your body. You have to understand when to expect these kind of things. Cutting back on basal insulin doses following workouts can be very effective. You can also cut back on bolus doses after heavy workouts, or you can give yourself a free snack that you don't take insulin for. Chocolate milk's actually become a very popular recovery sort of a drink to prevent a delayed drop in blood sugar. Use of a continuous glucose monitor is great for this because it allows you to track things and know when to expect these drops. But be aware that using a Libre, a Dexcom, a Medtronic sensor, or even an Eversense sensor, there tends to be a longer lag time during exercise than there is when you're not exercising. So just something to be aware of. And obviously, use of a hybrid closed loop can be effective because if your glucose starts to decline overnight, the closed loop system will automatically start reducing your basal insulin to help prevent those lows. So, do you think exercise can actually make blood sugar go up, and can it lead to ketoacidosis? Most people say yes to that question, but the fact is, exercise in and of itself burns energy. It burns glucose, it makes your body's cells more sensitive to insulin. So it's not actually the exercise that's making the blood sugars rise with certain activities. It's these counter-regulatory and stress hormones. Some forms of activity that cause us to produce a lot of adrenaline can cause the blood sugars to rise. Examples include heavy weightlifting, when you're using high weight with low reps, maximal types of lifts. Sports that involve bursts of activity. I would put cricket in that category, as well as golf. Even high intensity interval training, which is very popular now. Sprints, just short periods of time, moving as fast as you can, your blood sugar is likely to jump up a bit. Performances where you're being scored or graded or judged, and anytime winning becomes paramount. I see radical differences in my patients if they have a competitive game of soccer versus a practice. They're doing the same activity, but the intensity level is much higher for the game, and the blood sugars go up instead of coming down. There are a number of ways to prevent this. Some people use relaxation techniques to prevent the hormone production, but if it's unavoidable, you can actually give yourself insulin knowing when your blood sugar is going to rise. I would recommend that if you expect your glucose to rise 4 points during an activity, give enough insulin beforehand to prevent a 2-point rise. Give half the usual amount. This 50% rule is a good one. Give half of what you need to prevent the rise. If your glucose is elevated before any exercise, I'd also use half the usual dose to cover it. Some people experience a drop in their blood sugar during a workout, but a rise right afterwards. We talked before about how shutting off the pump's insulin delivery or disconnecting can cause that to happen. But it can also occur if you ate something before the workout that's digesting later, or if you consume too much carb during the workout, or if you still have stress hormones in circulation. So the strategies for managing that are pretty obvious. Suspending the pump for the workouts is not usually a good idea. If you eat a meal right beforehand, you might consider giving part of your bolus before that meal and then part of the bolus for the meal after the workout's over. There's also the question of, is there a blood sugar that's too high for safe exercise? In my feeling, there really is no such number. You can exercise safely with an elevated blood sugar, but your performance will likely suffer. It's not inherently dangerous to work out with elevated glucose levels. The exception is if you are ketotic. The presence of ketones is a sign that your body is severely deficient in insulin. Severe enough that exercising will cause the blood sugar to go much higher and will cause you to start producing even more ketones that can put you into ketoacidosis. So bottom line is, if you have an elevated blood sugar, an unexplainable elevated blood sugar before a workout, best to check for ketones. If your ketones are negative or minimal, you should be okay to exercise. Hydrate, definitely. Give yourself a dose of insulin to fix the high. Remember, half the usual dose, but give some insulin and then go work out. But if there's any ketones present, don't try to exercise. You probably need to reach out to your healthcare team for some troubleshooting. There are some blood glucose meters out there that also allow you to test for ketones on a blood sample. Those are nice to have around for just such occasions. As far as use, there's a lot of good ways, easy ways to wear a pump with different types of sports activities. The Omnipod is a good choice for people who engage in competitive activities or who are around water a lot of the time. But even with tube pumps, there are ways to attach them to your body and wear them in different places in different ways so they don't get in the way. Adhesion issues can sometimes occur both with pumps and infusion sets and with CGM sensors. The placement of the devices is critical. If you wear them on your abdomen, you're more likely to see them peel loose. Same thing with the arm. If you're having adhesion problems, consider going with the upper buttocks, the lower back, even the love handles. They tend to stick a little bit better in those places. And there's a variety of adhesive aids that can be used. Mastosol is the strongest one I know of. They had to invent this stuff called detachol just for removing the mastosol for some people. It's so strong. There are over tapes that can be used. It's one company called Griff Grips that makes adhesive patches with the holes pre-cut for different types of infusion sets and sensors. It's a wonderful type of a bandage for holding things in place. Temperature extremes can sometimes be a concern. I wouldn't worry too much about cold, as long as your insulin is near your body, whether it's in a pen or a vial or a pump. If it's up near your body, the insulin should not freeze. The only way it would freeze is if your body freezes. And if your body freezes, the insulin's the least of your problems. I wouldn't worry about that. But heat's another story. Once you starting to get up above 36 degrees centigrade, then you're going to run into problems. Your insulin is going to spoil. Even if you get up into the 30s for long periods of time, there's a good chance the insulin will lose some of its potency. So what I'd recommend you do is definitely keep the pump or your pen out of direct sunlight when you're out in hot weather. And you may have to just replace your insulin more frequently. You may have to just break out a new pen if you've had it outside for a long time. Don't leave it in the car. Even on a moderately temperature day, if the sun is beating down on that car, it can get really hot inside. There's a special cooling pouch called a Frio, and they design these for pens or pumps or vials. And all you do is you dampen the inner lining, and as it evaporates, it cools very nicely. It keeps things a good 8 to 10 degrees cooler than the outside temperature. So, with a little creativity and, a little bit of trial and adjustment, there's really nothing we can't accomplish. We've got professional athletes out there in every sport, male and female, who have type 1 diabetes. And we don't all have to be pro athletes. We can just have fun. We can work out, play a sport. If we think it through a little bit, like I say, if you think like a pancreas, there's just nothing you can't accomplish. So that's all I've got. I do want to mention that if anybody is looking for some additional guidance or coaching with their glucose control or any aspect of their diabetes, my practice is available to work with you. We have patients all over the world and certainly all across the UK. We've been doing phone and video consultations for decades now, even before the pandemic hit. So feel free to reach out.
Great, thank you, Gary. We do have some questions. We have a lot of questions, which means two things, right? It means that you've thrown up a lot of issues and people have been really engaged in the talk. So thank you. I've been trying to group them together. Certainly there's a bunch of questions about hypos and nighttime hypos. There's some questions about trying new sport, and there's some other sport specific questions. So let's do the hypo ones first. Someone asking is there something about 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. which being, as a particular time when hypos seem to be a problem after sport the previous day? Is there something about that time of night?
It's different from person to person, but that 3 a.m. time frame, and for some people, is a time when their body is producing very little glucose on its own. So for those people, there is an increased risk of a glucose drop, especially if their basal insulin dose isn't matched to what their needs are. If somebody is on injections, then they're probably not well matched. They probably get a little too much basal insulin during that time. And if they're on a pump and they haven't done the fasting tests to get their basals set correctly, the same thing happens. It's also relative to the timing of the sport. After school sports will often produce that delayed drop 6 to 10 hours later. So you're right around, that 2-3 a.m. time frame when that happens.
Okay. Also, while we're on hypos, there was a couple of people I picked up. Reese Danielle was one of them, and someone else who I think got some hypo unawareness and is particularly anxious, I think, about getting into sport or exercise because of their hypo unawareness. Any particular advice you'd give to them?
I'd say that's a terrible excuse not to get into a sport or exercise. Seriously, we have so many ways to detect low blood sugars long before they ever happen. Get yourself a Libre or a Dexcom, set those alerts at a very high conservative level so that they alert you long before a low is going to occur. Even if you can't use one of those, just finger stick regularly. You can catch lows long before they happen and prevent them in just about every case. And what that's going to do is actually reverse your hypo unawareness. You'll start to become more aware of your symptoms of low blood sugar when you have fewer lows. So I think that's ultimately the best way. And if you just make smart adjustments, if you want to be conservative initially, work out after a meal, cut the dose way back. If you run a little high, you run a little high, but at least you didn't have a low and you can be more confident next time. Maybe take a little more insulin the next time so your sugars aren't quite as high. But yeah, there's no excuse. If you're using fear of low blood sugar as an excuse not to exercise, you're fooling yourself, because that's not a good excuse.
Okay. There was a lot of sport specific or exercise specific kind of things going on in the chat. I think that the most common, the most chatted about one was hiking or longer distance walking. And I think there's a particular issue in the UK. There's something called the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, which kids do around age kind of 14 to 16, where that school-based program involves a kind of a weekend hike, which is kind of not optional. So any particular guidance around hiking or long distance walking, maybe for people who aren't practiced in that, who are doing it as a one-off activity as well?
Depending on the terrain, hiking on a challenging terrain can cause the blood sugar to drop immensely. And it's not just because of the physical nature of it, but the brain has to do a lot of work doing that kind of activity also. If you're on a treadmill just plodding away, your brain is not doing a thing, and it's not burning any fuel. But if you're on rugged terrain, your brain is doing a lot of work to help you navigate, and that's going to drop your blood sugar in addition to the physical aspect of the work. So if it's a course that you're hiking that you're very familiar with, you may not drop as much as one that you're new to. And if the course is, like I said, very rugged and has a lot of changes along the way, you're going to need to cut your insulin that much more. The other challenge there is just making sure you carry enough glucose, enough carbohydrate with you. I'm assuming most hikes are going to last several hours, so making adjustments to the basal insulin ahead of time will definitely be helpful. If you're not on a pump, it would be advantageous to try to get onto a pump so that you're able to do that sort of thing.
And are those basal adjustments different individual by individual? So when you talked about trial and error, is that something that each person needs to work out for themselves?
Absolutely. You can start out by cutting the basal by, say, 50%, beginning an hour to an hour and a half before the hike begins or whatever the workout is. Try that and see what happens. I mean, if you find your glucose just keeps tanking, obviously next time you got to cut back more. If you find you're just rising the whole time, next time you cut back less. It's a trial and adjustment process. But it's one that if you start with a 50% adjustment, you're probably not too far off. It's a good start.
Okay. And I can see in the chat there's lots of sharing of good advice around Duke of Edinburgh hikes going on right now. So that's hopefully helpful to some new parents. We had a number of kind of cold weather and water-based sport questions around tech. So worries about waterproofness of pumps for swimmers, and skiing holidays, and Dexcoms not liking cold water swimming, and buzzing that you were low as soon as you got in the water. Anything around the use of tech in cold weather and cold water?
Yeah, it's just one more challenge to try to overcome. The water part is interesting. Even though the CGM components are waterproof, the signal doesn't travel through water. But if you get out of the water periodically, you can get the signal and at least see where you are. Most of the CGMs will populate the data for the last few hours so you don't lose it. You can see what your trend looks like. From a pump standpoint, every pump that's made nowadays leaves the factory watertight. The problem is they don't stay watertight. With just wear and tear, little cracks form, little seams form, things loosen up, compartments don't get covered right, and water can get in. Does that mean it's going to kill the pump if it gets wet or water gets in? Who knows? But they all warranty them so that you can get a free replacement if water does get So I wouldn't, be deterred from engaging in different types of activities. If you're using a pump or a CGM, there's always ways to make it work. And I mentioned the Omnipod's a great one for water sports because that thing's sealed. It's like iron. It will hold up under just about any conditions that you'll find.
Okay. We had what I thought was a really interesting question related to this this question of the effect of adrenaline in competitive sport. So you talked about blood sugars going up because of competitive sport. Someone was asking, is there any particular type of exercise that their son could do in the warm-up that would counteract the rise once competitive action started?
There's a variety of things people have tried. Some have been successful, some have not. Depends on the individual. Paced breathing exercises can sometimes help, slow paced breathing. Some people meditate. Some people just do a prolonged stretch. Doing a prolonged stretching routine can sometimes help. Anything that has a calming and soothing effect, I can just put on some music I like and it relaxes me. So it's different for different people. But if you find a routine you can do that allows you to relax and focus, that's a good thing, because the less adrenaline you're producing going into that workout, the better not only the better you can control your blood sugar, but also the better you can control your fine motor movements. If you got a lot of adrenaline flowing, it's hard to control fine motor skills, and performance in a sport can really suffer.
Okay. There are 2 or 3 people asking questions about something I can't relate to at all, which is exercise before breakfast in the morning. So there's a question about whether early morning exercise, whether actually there's something different going on there because of, you haven't yet bolused, et cetera, et cetera. So is there anything you just want to say about people that are mad enough to be jogging at 6 o'clock in the morning?
I'm with you, Chris. I'm not a morning person. I think my biorhythm kicks in at about 6 in the evening. I usually work out at night, but I mean, there are times I have worked out early morning. It is a different time of day for most people because hormonally, there are certain hormones the body just naturally produces in the early morning hours. Growth hormone being one, cortisol being another. And when those hormones are being produced and you add exercise to it, it tends to drive the blood sugars up instead of down. So that's why we see such a difference in the glucose response to an early morning workout as opposed to later in the day. The fact that you haven't bolused is also a consideration. Bolus insulin, like it or not, lasts a long time. We like to think it's gone in 3 or 4 hours, but oftentimes even the rapid analog insulins can still be working 6 hours later. So during the daytime, if you bolus previously, there's probably still some of that in circulation affecting things. But if you were to fast all day and work out in the evening, your blood sugar would still drop more than it would in the early morning hours.
Okay, and one last question, so I know we're a little bit over time, but I think this is another kind of interesting one, relates to the current situation. So that I think in what we find, I don't know about the US, in the UK, there's a big growth in cycling, in biking. There's new schemes for subsidizing getting people bikes, the whole thing about lockdown and the pandemic. So someone interestingly here kind of started cycling into work at the beginning of the day. How is that going to affect the rest of their day? I mean, presumably the effect of the exercise is going to last for most of the working day in that kind of setup.
Yeah, it varies depending on the length of the ride, how many hills there are, things like that. I've done that myself because I only live about 6 kilometers from my office. So on a nice day, I will bike in sometimes. I find that my blood sugar later that morning might tend to drop a little bit, but that's my own individual response. Everyone's is different. I would say, try it and see what you get. If you find that your glucose just keeps dropping during the day after you bike in the morning, you may have to cut back on your basal insulin that day, or you may have to cut back a little on each of the boluses that you give during the course of the day. When I play basketball, getting back to my first, my intro, I usually play basketball in the evening, and if I run full court, my blood sugar will start to drop the next day before lunch. That's my delayed drop. That just shows how individualized this is. Who would think that, the next day before lunch, I have to worry because I played basketball the night before. So diabetes is not easy. It takes a lot of work and a lot of individual attention to figure these things out.
Great. Thank you. I think that's a really good place to end it. I mean, about the kind of the tools that you're giving people to think about these things and trial them for their own individual sports and their own individual reactions to those.
Can I give my
sports.
email? So if people have other questions, they can send them to me.
Yeah.
It's Gary, Gary, at integrateddiabetes.com. I don't know if there's a way to post that somewhere.
You can post it in the chat probably, and if not, we will make sure that when the recording is sent out that we put that on as well. So
yeah. I don't know if somebody don't have the chat option on my screen. That's okay. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind sharing it, I'm more than happy
we'll
to answer any questions people email me.
Yeah, cool. Thanks ever so much for sharing with us, Gary, and everybody for joining us this afternoon. Thank you.